In this section, we're now going to see how we can merge all these concepts and integrate Java EE applications in Kubernetes clusters. We're going to see, first of all, how we can configure Java EE applications in Kubernetes, then how we can manage application credentials, and how to also persist state in Kubernetes clusters. Then we're going to see how we can access these services within clusters and how we can define resource limits, and then also how we can manage multiple application environments. And the first video is about how we can configure enterprise applications in Kubernetes. We're going to see how we can integrate these config maps that we saw earlier into Java EE, how we can do that using CDI producers, and how we can configure our application using property files and environment variables. So you already saw these config maps earlier, and here we have a CDI producer that for now reads a properties file out of the deployment artifact. So that property file is included in the class path that is now still part of our project and still part of the build archive. So if we would like to configure all these information from Kubernetes, from our config maps, then first of all, let's define a config map that then already contains all this information. We call this coffee shop config. And now that's an interesting story here. You heard that all these config maps contain key value pairs. And now how that is included in Kubernetes runtimes and workloads is that we could either map all these key value pairs to environment variables and then define environment variables, or now in our case, since we have several configured values, we want to showcase this with so-called volumes. So this means that ultimately there will be a file available in the running container that contains the contents of this file, of, basically our properties file. And we do this by defining the key as the file name, application properties, and the value as the contents of our file. So basically, we can copy paste our properties file inside our YAML definition. Well, you need to be sure that you indent correctly. And then all this will be the value of the key and will later on be the contents of our file. In order to use this, we will define a so-called volume into our container by mounting a volume with a name. Let's call this coffee shop config volume. And this will be mounted to, a specific path, for example, /config. Then we can also define it to be read-only. And now we still have to define this volume that we try to mount here. So we can have volume definitions that, for example, we call coffee shop config volume. By the way, here you see the power of an IDE integration with YAML files and specifically with Kubernetes or OpenShift resource definitions. So now we have an auto-completion of all the options that are available there. This is very helpful, especially if you cannot remember all these properties. And then we say this comes from a so-called config map, and the config map, the name is coffee shop config, and that's it. Because now everything here will be taken from the config map, and this will result in files being created under the mount path with the name of the files being the key of the config, the keys of the config map, and the contents of the files, the individual values. So there will be here now one file application properties with this content. And then in our application, this means that now we no longer access a class path resource here, rather than we say this will be a file input stream from /config /application properties. And this will be loaded then from the file system, and ultimately these values come from the config map. So for us, this means that we can just delete the properties files here, because otherwise that would be dead code, and then include it in our config map, load it from the configurator, and then inject these values, for example, in our order processor with our custom CDI qualifier. This is just a custom config qualifier where we have a value, a configured value that will be taken, well, dynamically to be loaded from the properties resource that we load from our file. And this is one way how we can integrate the configuration into the Java EE application from a Kubernetes cluster. Similarly, we could also include it in environment variables. This is more like a matter of taste, or in other words, it depends how many values we have configured. So for example, we could say we want to have the values that we have here, such as the processor URI, with the value being taken from a config map, and so on and so forth, and can configure that appropriately. Or we say we have equally well and from. That means we include multiple environment variables, and all of them will be, well, multiple config map configured values. But again, this is just a matter of taste. For this example, we will just use volume mounts, since it makes sense to include and load these from properties files. If you were to include environment variables, well, then you would use systemenv to load these in Java here and then make them injectable via CDI. Now, in order to run this, we will rebuild this to image version 4. Maven clean package. We have to rebuild our Maven build to build a new WAR file, and then issue a new build to version 4. Push that Docker image as well, and then adapt our resource to then deploy it to a cluster. And now we will see that the deployment has been configured and also a config map was created with these values. And then ultimately, we could now either wait for application startup, or what we could also do, since we already learned how to troubleshoot resources, we could, for example, look into the newly created container and say we want to just open a shell just for debug purposes and see whether this file has been created. And here you see a couple of, well, symlinks. And if we look at the contents, then this application properties file has been created, and this is the contents from our config map. Similarly, we can have a look at the config map that we just created. For example, say, please give me that config map in YAML output format, and then we will have similar configured values that we just put in our project.